Assalamualaikum and a very good morning, everyone. Welcome to RSOG School of Government 7 webinar in 2021, our 20th installment in total. Today's webinar is called Diplomacy, a year since the pandemic. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items and the structure of our webinar session today. To those who follow this webinar through Zoom, please mute your microphones. We are also broadcasting this webinar live on our Facebook. This webinar session is divided into 3 segments. First, we will begin with key questions posed to our guest speaker. Then, we will answer questions from participants. At any time during the webinar, you may submit your questions to the guest speaker. Just type your questions in the chat and comment section. Please keep your question short and straightforward. As time allows, we will address as many questions as possible. Lastly, we will then wrap up today's webinar session. This webinar is recorded, and you will be able to access this recording via our Facebook and YouTube page. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speaker today. Dr. Fitz-Gerald is the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs and a professor in Wilfrid Laurier University's Political Science Department. She has worked at both at King's College London's University International Policy Institute and at Cranfield University, where she was the director, Defence and Security Leadership. During her time at Cranfield, and led the UK government-funded Global Facilitation Network for Security Sector Reform and Cranfield Centre for Security Sector Management. She also designed and developed the Master's Program in Security Sector Management, which is delivered in both UK and East Africa. Dr. N is widely published on issues concerning conflict, national security, and security sector governance. She holds visiting professor at other universities, including Nkumba University, Uganda, Jimma University, Ethiopia, Nyala University, Sierra Leone, and Queen's University in Canada, and has advised and has been seconded to work with a number of countries on issues relating to national security policy, strategy issues, including Ukraine, Lebanon, Indonesia, and Nigeria. She has also supported internationally sponsored peace talks, including support to the AU High Implementation Panel during the post-referendum peace talks between North and South Sudan. In 2018, Anne was appointed as a senior research associate at the Royal United Services Institute in London. In 2013, she became a senior security and justice advisor for the UK government, and she was appointed visiting professor of global security management at Queen's University. In 2012, the government of Canada awarded Anne the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for her contribution to post-conflict resolution and national policy dialogue. In 2011, Anne was invited a visiting professor at the Royal Military College of Canada. In 2019, RSOG School of Government collaborated with Dr. Anne and her team at Balsillie School of International Affairs to design and develop an executive education program relating to the government. The pandemic largely limited the implementation of the program. Dr. Anne Fitz-Gerald, let us get started. The first question to the guest speaker, what is diplomacy?
Well, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. It's lovely to be here with all of you. And after a year of not traveling, even to see you all with that sunshine behind you in a part of the world that I really do love and enjoy is wonderful. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. And let me start by addressing your first question. So the definition of diplomacy in a very straightforward way is a profession, activity, or skill of managing international relations, typically by overseas missions, or what we call diplomatic infrastructure. But of course, diplomacy also refers to a verb or an action and the art of dealing with people in a sensitive but effective way. So diplomacy is something that should be regarded as a national instrument of power. And countries around the world don't have all the same national instruments of power, but it's usually what gets represented at the cabinet level of a government. So if you have your national interests that are derived from your core values, you're constantly keeping your eye on the strategic environment in which a country like Malaysia exists, the way in which that strategic environment impacts on those things that are dear to your heart, like the national interests, elicits a response depending on whether this strategic environment impacts on vital interests, altruistic interests, humanitarian interests, major interests, etc. And the response is the use of national instruments of power, of which diplomacy is one. The economy is another, the military and the security sector is another, the social instruments of power as well, like education, something I'll speak about in a moment. So I would encourage you to think about diplomacy as a national instrument of power. It relies on a certain level of infrastructure spread out across the world, but also a good visionary central headquarters in the national capital. Why is that important? Because more and more we're seeing the use of diplomacy as an instrument of soft power used more and more and becoming more and more important. And that requires good strategic planning from the headquarters, good investment in human resources. It's not any longer people going on to the dinner party circuit and the cocktail circuit. Diplomats, effective diplomats, work very hard these days to good ends. And strategic communications becomes very important as well. And I'll come back to that a bit later and highlight areas where this is working very well at the moment and what happens when strategic communications don't work so well. So I hope that gives an idea of where I'm coming to on the issue of diplomacy. Shall I introduce the next slide, or would you like to move on to that?
I think we can proceed to the next slide.
Okay, so I think what given was what makes diplomacy so important. Well, in multilateralism, it is impossible as a small middle power or a small power country, and there aren't too many great powers in the world today. So we're all, I'm talking to you from Canada at the moment, and we are battling for our middle power status, and we want to be a strong middle power. UK is an interesting case in point at the moment. The UK was an empire, of course, in its previous history, and it is now facing a very, very constrained situation at home, post-Brexit, an enormous Brexit divorce bill to pay for its separation from the European Union. On top of that, it has a very big bill to pay in its post-COVID situation. The UK government supported what's called a furlough scheme, so everybody could keep their jobs. It's probably going to be dealing with a very, very strained economy over the next 5 years. And for that reason, there's no surprise that it's just gone through a very in-depth strategic planning exercise around the integrated security and foreign policy review. And that's got big implications for the Southeast Asian region and how the UK engages in that region in the future. It was very much probably the main focal point of the review, as was its quest for an affiliate membership of ASEAN. So it's trying to maneuver smartly at the moment and invest greatly in diplomatic infrastructure in Southeast Asia. So we, as most countries start looking inward, faced with the need to build back better, build back their economies, build cleaner, greener solutions and sustainable economies, sustainable societal solutions. There is much to accomplish in what is called the mini or the microlateralist domain, as well as through big multilateral institutions. We're also seeing some difficulties in all those multilateral institutions that we subscribe to. The United Nations, for instance, can't afford to pay its elevator bills at the moment. It's facing serious financial constraints. It is also seeing its main decision-making body, the UN Security Council, gridlocked as a result of a divide that has been created between the permanent 5 members and 2, notably China and Russia. So it begs the question as to how effective and progressive and constructive higher order politics is at the moment at the UN. So a lot of countries around the world are facing the need to look at their multilateral priorities and make some hard decisions. Is it worth paying the dues and being involved in an ongoing way in an alliance like NATO for some Western countries? Is it worth committing to the OECD? Think about all those regional organizations on the African continent. And of course, ASEAN stands out as quite a dynamic organization in relation to some of these ones that I'm mentioning. But my own view is that the United Nations will move forward based on some of its effective agencies. And international support will continue for those agencies. But there's even serious question marks being drawn above the World Bank and the IMF at the moment. For instance, the World Bank did not make accurate predictions about the 2007 financial crisis, and it's being ridiculed by some analysts for not properly advising the world on what their economies would be facing post-COVID. So, all is not well in the multilateral environment that we've been used to and that we've been comfortable with for so many years. I know Canada is making some decisions on that front at the moment. For instance, the Arctic Council has become very important for a country like Canada, where the next black swan, as we call it, would probably hit first and worst for Canada in the north, in the Arctic. Whilst we can't compete on many levels with the United States, one thing that we do have that is strong and healthy with the US is our defense relations and our bilateral defense relationship. So, a SWOT analysis would always tell you to invest in the strengths and bolster the strengths. Don't always focus on the negativity of the threats, but generate more capacity to support strengths. And so if we do that, Canada, we would have to make an investment in the Arctic. The Arctic makes up 40% of our country. It's cold and it's dark, but to be sovereign, we still need to be able to patrol every square foot of it. And commentators in the past have said that the United States cares more about our Arctic than Canada does, the NORAD agreement. But we're getting a bit concerned when we see joint military operations between Russia and China in the Arctic Ocean, getting close to some of the passages above Canada. We know that China as a country has declared itself as a near Arctic member of the Arctic Council. So we're having non-Arctic countries very interested in this landmass and the seaways for use of commercial shipping and trade routes. So the last thing I would say in terms of why diplomacy is so important is because we're increasingly not very well tooled for peace and security in the world. On one side, we have these tools that express condemnation, express concern, in some ways express support. Look at the situation in Myanmar at the moment. You hear a lot of concern being expressed, but what is actually happening on the ground? On the other end, we have these tools that are all about stabilization, intervention, sanctions, real use of coercive instruments of power. And we don't have much in the middle. So we've got one end of the spectrum, we've got the other end of the spectrum, and increasingly we need that middle ground to be supported. So what do I mean by the middle ground? Well, this is where diplomacy really comes in. More and more, we will see democratic transitions happening in the future. We'll get behind the leaders that take office, just like we did with Aung San Suu Kyi, just like we did with Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia, and then things go wrong and things get messy. And the international community tends to back away because we lack those hard tools, either soft at one end of the spectrum or hard and coercive at the other end. There's room for things like dialogue, mediation, political reconciliation. Don't forget, a lot of those democratic transitions will involve transformative leadership changes, sometimes within the same party. So that breaks into victor and vanquish politics during the time of a political transition. And relationships need to be smoothed, or the vanquished become the spoilers. And, whether that includes forgiveness or truth commissions or just trying as a national dialogue process to come together and unify as a society, because that's probably the strongest protection of national interests, is to gain national resilience as a society, cut across political affiliations, cut across religious affiliations, sectarian differences, etc., depending on what country you are in, and bind together when you need to. And that's something I would say my country, Canada, is very good at. We have never been so politically divided as we have at the moment, but we come together when we need to. We are a very diverse, multicultural society. In fact, Toronto, which is just down the road from me at the moment, is the biggest multicultural capital in the world, and it's not even a federal capital, it's a provincial capital. Trust, relationships, networks. These were so important post-pandemic. And those without them really made gains less quick than others with those networks in place. And don't forget, in the post-pandemic world, when we were all restricted, well, we still are to a large extent from traveling, diplomacy is something that must continue to the greatest extent possible to be done in person, because home truths can be told, things can be shared, which may be sensitive in terms of information, but the best business concerning diplomacy is done in person. So I'd like to talk now about your third slide, diplomacy in a post-pandemic world. As I mentioned, many countries are now looking inward. They are committing to their population during a time when nationalist parties have gained ground, and nationalist parties have increasingly got supporters that are demanding that overseas aid budgets get stripped down to focus aid at home. Overseas supporters that are putting pressure on the government to stop funding for certain international organizations, hence threatening the international system of governance and the rules-based order. In the US, I should say, we're all trying to build back better. And this will take a strategic visionary approach. Why? Because it has to galvanize cross-talent enterprise in government. It's not just up to the economic advisors. It's not just up to the climate change teams. It's not just up to the critical infrastructure people. It's all of those groups together that need to come together. So governments almost need to dispatch dedicated teams that can develop 20 to 30-year strategies that will outlive the government of the day in most cases, but which the governments of the day will know what the incremental contribution to that 30-year vision is. That's the kind of widespread change that we're facing at the moment. Pivoting the kind of cars we drive, pivoting the information technology we use, a heavy reliance on the virtual world, increasing use of artificial intelligence, increasing threats in the cyberspace and the space space. And so there's a lot of known unknowns and unknown unknowns as we ironically set out on this far-reaching journey. So the United States is obviously in an interesting and worrying tense situation with China. The United States recently announced that it announced that it was commissioning a 100-day review of its supply chain resiliency. Around the same time, it announced that its national security policy would be indistinguishable from its economic policy. So in effect, its national security policy is for the American middle class and is part of this building back strategy. What does that mean for foreign policy? It means that the United States will prioritize access to and consumption of clean tech metals and minerals and resources. So like zinc, lithium, niobium, tantalum, phosphate, and other resources. This is the implication for foreign policy. And it's losing logic, I would say, as a result. For example, Egypt is instrumental to the US Middle East peace process. The US has turned against certain African countries in the Horn of Africa, such as Ethiopia and its Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, because it's supporting Egypt, because it needs Egypt. Egypt has developed a new alliance with Sudan, and we're seeing military threats to bomb what is tantamount to a country's national water infrastructure. So you will all know about dams and transboundary international laws on water sharing. Those rules aren't being followed at all here. Those rules are being discarded for higher geopolitics because of the United States' pursuit of a foreign policy developed around economic interests. So at the same time, we're seeing China way ahead of the process of supply chain resilience and its quest not only to be economically supreme in the world, but also to achieve carbon neutral by 2050. It's way ahead of everybody else on this. And it has preferred partnership status in continents like Africa and elsewhere because of the infrastructural commitment it gives through the Belt and Road programs and all its arteries. So this is interesting from a number of standpoints, as I'm sure you know, because infrastructure buys long-term political voice. Infrastructural investment takes years to develop. It also takes years to pay back, especially when you're a developing country or a poor country. So there's a Loctite relationship with China that emerges for years. The Chinese run the toll booths on the road. They run the port kiosks that collect the excise taxes, and all that money pays back the infrastructure that it develops. China still, to a great extent, considers itself a developing nation as well. And for that reason, it's not in the Paris group. And it's not yet prepared to relieve countries of debt. It's prepared to reschedule some of it, but not to relieve it. And so think about how so many countries are locked into those long-term loans. China won't budge from that because it still considers itself developing. And we need to see Chinese money in the future work better for the world, I think, and for it to reform its strategic policy to resonating with that of a developed country as opposed to a developing country. So we see these geopolitics tensions at the moment, and from a diplomatic perspective, it will be very important to know where nations situate themselves amidst those tensions. For those receiving assistance, I know many developing countries are starting to think, how can we benefit from these superpower politics and tensions playing out on our soil? Because it's leading to a bit of a proxy battle in many different parts of the world, this superpower tension and the pursuit of clean tech minerals. So we have also seen China's not the only difficult partner. We saw only this morning Russia fire at a Royal Navy, a British Royal Navy vessel that was moving around the Crimea area. So diplomacy becomes very critical for pursuing pragmatic approaches with difficult partners when things become sticky. And also when there are some red lines that are impacting on your diplomatic relationships with countries, and we're seeing more and more red lines develop. For Canada, for instance, there are red lines concerning the capture of the two Michaels in China at the moment. And until the two Michaels are released, I don't think our diplomatic relationship with China will be able to move forward. But in thinking pragmatically, we can still work with difficult partners at the diplomatic level. There's maneuverability, there's agility, there's scope to bring civil society to civil society together in a bilateral type of relationship. So diplomacy becomes very effective for working with difficult partners. And based on your national interests and core values, we'll always know what we can stand up and rant and rave about, but and where red lines are drawn, but also what we can do as well. And I mean, I think what we can do, the way the West is leading Western countries are thinking about what we can do with China, is try to work at the technical level to ensure that infrastructure comes with good quality standards, try to work to encourage China to work through the international system of governance instead of sending money and PPE and all sorts of other things direct to those countries and sometimes even direct to the militaries of those countries. So being an international player in an international system of governance. Education, I'd like to talk about education because, like diplomacy, it becomes a very important tool of soft power, which can be projected by way of diplomacy. So we all want to have the brightest and the best come to our countries by way of students, by way of faculty at universities. So having reputable higher education institutions becomes quite key for diplomacy. It allows you to engage in science diplomacy. It allows you to engage in defense diplomacy. And that's all about sending people to countries that you're interested in to work through soft power channels to generate trusted relationships, to influence learning and exposure, and to have some ambassadors on the ground and a generation of ambassadors as they grow up. And sometimes when you do this in group form, and I remember teaching a course for a number of years in Indonesia, and we had different countries in the ASEAN region all come to Indonesia for the purpose of this master's program, as a result of which there is a network in the region which is based on that cohort of students that sticks together. And when somebody wants, a Singapore colleague wants to contact his Malaysian counterpart, and so on and so forth in the other countries, they just pick up the telephone or they go into the WhatsApp group. So regional diplomatic infrastructure is important as well. And I know one thing Canada is focusing on at the moment, because there are a lot of higher education institutions here which have a large Chinese community, but very few other Southeast Asian representatives. And the view should be, let's influence by engaging with other potential future partners as well, and let them liaise with our Chinese colleagues and bring other ideas and share other ideas, so that we can promote different approaches to all these concepts that we learn about in one country. And don't forget the curriculum, the higher education curriculum in the world writ large is very influenced by the Anglo-American experience and the Westphalian democratic peace. And there are other views, right? We only need to look at China and to a certain extent, South Korea and Taiwan, et cetera, for the developmental state building model experience, revolutionary approach to economic development. And the West doesn't know too much about this model, and it needs to in the future. Maybe I will stop there since we're now over the half hour, just so we can open it up to questions and get as many in as possible.
Thank you very much, Anne, for the insightful introductions on the topic. If we gather you accurately so far, talking about diplomacy, about dealing with people, situation, where it could be multidimensional, it have linked to powers, it have linked to infrastructures, linked to decision, also vision. It is important to economics, the social, and what you shared with us. After the pandemic, it seems that many countries are going inward, the sense of nationalism. You also touch on education as a way of diplomacy, especially at the regional level. So we have received a string of questions, and we're going to start with the first question from Anis. The question reads, how do we exercise diplomacy when we are dealing with financial crisis?
It's an excellent question. But I would say diplomacy can be very good value for money, very good value for money. And we're now looking at hybrid ways of working as well, bringing people into a room by screens as well as in person. Sometimes we forget the ease of just picking up a telephone as well and calling people. but there's got to be a foundation supporting that. So diplomacy can be enabled by way of some of a government's other instruments of power, like higher education, for instance, like joint training, like options with defense diplomacy. So you can achieve a lot in diplomacy through value for money propositions. It's getting the right people involved as well. And in the past, it wasn't something that a lot of thought was put into, right? People who were sociable, as they say in Britain, who could drink a good gin and tonic, and who could play a good round of golf, got the jobs, but now it's a completely different job, right? So it's hideously important at the moment, oddly enough, in the midst of a financial crisis, and whilst we all have to pivot, because we learned through the COVID pandemic just how interconnected we all were. And the countries that were ahead of the game in the response to the COVID pandemic were those great networks. We couldn't rely on the World Health Organization. In my view, it was weak in the early stages. It even said that we didn't need masks, right? So diplomacy was key here, and building those trusted relationships, even without too many resources necessary for them, is key. I always think if you have a little bit of money on the ground, and some diplomatic missions in different countries require funds to be sent from the national capital, but other countries have funds available on the ground for local engagement, local purposes. They're the ones that can practice self-diplomacy very well and have networks in place. Civil society is always a good link for diplomatic infrastructure as well. And civil society relationships are very cheap as well. I'm civil society, right? I'm a academic. My reputation is based on the integrity of my research and my reporting. So at any stage, if a diplomat called me up and said, we'd love to hear your views on this subject. We know you're an expert in this subject. So would you be, like, academics generally and research think tanks, they're only too willing to bounce ideas off of you concerning your hypotheses you might have. So I think it's one of those tools, aside from the cost of putting people on the ground for the long term and diplomatic residences, et cetera, is a fairly cheap way of operating.
That's an excellent point that you made about the importance of networking. It brings us to the next question from Zarawi. And Zarawi is asking you what it takes to be a diplomatic person.
Well, I definitely agree that it's an art. I think the number one priority is that you have to be a good listener, because trust is built if someone knows you're listening and someone knows you're responding. There's what I call supply-driven and demand-driven diplomacy. Demand-driven is all about countries that have their pots of funds at home in their national capitals linked to strategic policy agenda. They have to push those strategic policy agenda items in the country that they're representing. They have tools, they have different offerings, and that pushed upon you becomes a supply-driven way of engaging. Countries with good national strategies and visions, and I say strategy because remember, strategy operationalizes policy. So even policy priorities that are achievable and not aspirational become really important, because that gives you national resilience. You can turn to those who want to work with you and say, actually, thank you very much for your kind offer of support. We have a strategy, we're very proud of it, and actually we're struggling on resources in this area. So this is how you could really help us. If all countries work that way, the assistance would be so much better targeted. But for a country like Malaysia, it also gives the country an idea of what partnerships can help support that national strategy and that direction and pathway that it's chosen. And as I said earlier, some of those will be existing partnerships and relationships, and other ones will be new ones in this post-pandemic phase. So somebody who is a good listener, somebody who's an excellent communicator, and not just communicating, and this is where I've been critical to my own country, Canada, in the past. I find that because of the lack of strategies and policies at the top, the diplomats in country tend to very easily go into detail. And detail at the diplomatic level is not very well remembered. What is memorable are key strategic messages. So good communicators being able to go into a room and saying, yes, these are the three things we prioritize in our foreign policy. And I can see this particular area, whether it's, gender-based empowerment, I can see this gender-based empowerment priority for us supporting you in a number of ways. And that generates a discussion, right? Because it's always a bit of meat in the middle. But following up with those people, being a good strategic communicator on media as well. Missions are brought into the media spotlight more and more these days. And, if you lose the media battle and the information battle, guess what battle will win? The one on social media that is increasingly going against the ground-based truth. Different groups in society pit themselves off of each other on social media. So you get a war fought on the keyboard and you get a conflict on the ground, completely different situations usually. Somebody asked in the questions about Palestine. This is going on in Palestine, this is going on in Ukraine, this is going on in the Tigray region of Ethiopia at the moment, where diaspora and people with an interest in the conflict are dominating the conflict narrative on social media in a way that has a frightening alignment with the media, like what have been normally reputable media outputs, like the New York Times, like the Washington Post. And so, there's this groupthink that developed in the international media, and it's based on questionable evidence now. So we're living this era of misinformation and disinformation. We've always lived with those two things. You can even date back to Germany in the late 1930s. But when it gets the layer of social media on top, it can be manipulated in so many different ways. And I see a question about digital diplomacy. It's a real challenge for digital diplomacy because, if you don't get in there and set the narrative correctly, others will do it for you. Others will move into that space. And so you have to be a master of the narrative as a diplomat. You have to be a good interviewee for the media. You have to issue press releases regularly. You have to put things up on Facebook, Twitter, etc. pages. And that requires thinking. You can't be sloppy there or else it'll bounce back at you negatively.
Since you mentioned about digital diplomacy, and Yumeneswaran is asking, do you know any countries that have developed digital diplomacy?
Well, the UN, of course, has this digital lab, exclusion lab. Maybe it's digital governance. There is an agenda in the UN at the moment. Digital inclusion, that's what it is. And I think this is an area where we need help from your region of the world very quickly. I think we're all relying on the internet and the digital space at the moment, 150%. And yet, policy in this area is grossly underdeveloped. Checks and balances, accountability, and And when policy and when technology innovation outstrips the pace of policy to control conduct, you know, there are lots of problems that can break out. So I think we should really be calling for an international organization for digital governance. I'm not sure if the UN is the right body to, you know, based on all the bureaucratic bottlenecks it's experiencing and the number of member states. I wonder if this should be done sort of like climate change as a conference of parties and as an agreed headquarters somewhere. But my bet would be Southeast Asia or Canada.
On Southeast Asia, in particular the ASEAN countries, this question from Afik and talking about the global security challenges that the ASEAN countries have to face vis-a-vis US-China relations.
I'm just looking in the chat. Who asked that?
Afik.
Afik.
Afik Ismaizam.
Okay. What do you think the current global security challenges? Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said earlier on, I think it needs to know where it's going to position itself as a country, as an ASEAN country. You don't want to get caught in the Cold War politics, right? So it shouldn't be about trying to move into one camp or another. I think one, the question has to be asked, where do you position yourself diplomatically? And two, how do you make sure the Cold War tension between the two countries benefits you instead of has a negative impact on you? So that is one thing I would say. I think whereas China's Belt and Road Initiative is not, against popular belief, supporting a military expansionist policy, I think China will exercise its muscles in the South China Sea because it's its own immediate neighborhood. And we have seen a huge investment in military hard power over the last year for China. So I think ASEAN countries stand to impact from any standoff or acts of aggression in the Southeast or in the South China Sea. I think supply chains and diversification of trade is very important. So ASEAN countries becoming linked to each other to then form new arteries under new trade arrangements with new partners and existing partners is a challenge, but I think it's not an insurmountable challenge. And I think this is the biggest opportunity that post-COVID opens. I think the internet governance issue, I think the misinformation, disinformation, trying to prevent conflict anywhere in the region because of that. And the whole pivoting and transitioning of economies as well, and making sure all the people are brought forward in a very inclusive way in that pivoting.
And I have to start taking questions from the Facebook page. There's this question from Rahima. Rahima was mentioning that many countries have missions abroad physically. With the advancement of education, is it really necessary to have such infrastructure, considering digital diplomacy and so on?
Well, I think it's a good question, and it goes back to what I was saying about national interests and the policy response to national interests. So you've got your national interests and core values, you have the strategic environment in which Malaysia exists, and the impact of that strategic environment on what is dear to the heart of Malaysia and Malaysians in the way of national interests ends up becoming demanding of a policy response, whether it's to enhance things, whether it's to guard against things, whether it's to defend against other things, whether it's to project and pursue things. Then you've got your instruments of national power to do all those things with, including diplomacy. So depending on what those priorities are, which will make it achievable as opposed to a aspirational strategy, foreign policy, you've got to make hard decisions, right? You may have less diplomatic infrastructure in some places, more being propped up in others because of the task ahead and the priorities that you've set. So, and I think sometimes leadership is, I mean, I always think the best inspirational leaders are the ones that make those tough decisions and explain very clearly, not only to their population, but also to the countries being impacted by those decisions, why they're making them. So, for example, the British National Security Strategy in 2015 outlined pandemic, a global pandemic, as one of the threats. But it was one issue, policy priority, in a big, long laundry list of priorities. It was an unimplementable strategy because it couldn't be resourced. And so choices were made amongst that big laundry list, and the pandemic preparedness wasn't one of them. And that's why Britain didn't have the right infrastructure in place and playbook in place to deal in a more optimal way with the COVID-19 pandemic. So I hope that goes some way to answering the question. It's not just a case of diplomatic presence on the ground. It is where the priorities are and following the priorities. Also working with regionalism as well. So if Malaysia's engagement in certain parts of the world is more on a regional basis, then one mission representing the region and engaging regionally should be fine.
And talking about priority, the priority at the moment is to be vaccinated. So Hayati has a question to you on the vaccine diplomacy. Would you like to share your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, let me start by saying we're not safe until the world is safe, right? So I think we have to go on that premise. And what concerns me is that vaccines are being used for economic purposes and for trade purposes. And that sort of goes against a lot of the principles and general approach to addressing critical challenges to humanity in the international system of governance. And as a result, we're seeing a lot of bilateral engagement, China included. Those countries that can do it, not all of them, but some of them are doing it around economic interests. And so it's a reminder that we have to have sight of our humanitarian interests, as well as security interests and economic interests. And these are all important expressions for diplomats to be equipped with, because you have to be able to explain to people, either your diplomatic counterparts or in guest presentations as a diplomat or on the media, you have to be able to stand up and say, these are our national interests or these are our security interests, and we prioritize doing X, Y, and Z to project, defend, and promote them. And it's a priority for us at the moment, and that is what we will do. So the vaccine diplomacy issue has to come with some rationale as well. And I think eyebrows would be raised if people said, okay, well, this is a humanitarian interest. It's very much in our interest to get this vaccine out to as many partner countries as possible. But if it's for the humanitarian interest, then you're not going to engage economically on that front. If you do, you will have a negative impact on other national instruments, I would say. So this speaks to the question marks that we were putting over the international community too, and those international organizations. I mean, the World Health Organization should be setting the standards. should be offering the guidance on how vaccines should be disseminated, and should be holding those who don't follow international rules-based order. They should be outed. They should be accountable. But we don't do a very good job of that at the moment. So, you know, I know there are some leadership issues in the World Health Organization. America sort of opted out and then it's back in again. And I suspect that there are some resource shortfalls as well. But it's a good point on vaccine diplomacy. And then this is where we need to work with our fellow diplomats to influence them and say, look, you know, memories are long. And in 10 years' time, if you seek to do trade with a country that you deprioritize because of vaccines going elsewhere, because of economic interests, that will be remembered.
Last question then from Hidayatul. She's asking about the United Nations, which she argued has not settled not even one issue since inception. What is your thoughts on United Nations?
The United Nations hasn't what?
Has not settled one issue since its inception. Is it because of poor leadership? Yeah.
I agree entirely. I think the work, the decent work is done by some of the agencies. And even the work of these agencies in a place like the Horn of Africa is being questioned at the moment because of partisan relationships. And also it works in places where it just engages with a state when some of the actual threats and the issues that the UN is there for are on a regional basis, but the UN doesn't have regional mandates. So it's a difficult one. I think the Security Council issue is an issue. I don't think we're going to see permanent 5 Security Council membership change in our lifetime. Certainly, it's too difficult. You know, India, Pakistan would have problems if India went in, vice versa. Others would have problems if Brazil was brought in. Others are just not the powerful countries they once were. So I think we're sort of sitting and stagnating a little bit. I think the one thing that will test the UN's resolve and its support amongst its member states is the extent to which they meet the Sustainable Development Goals. I guess one issue is people can always blame COVID for not meeting things and not realizing agenda these days. But I think all eyes will be on the United Nations in 2030 and the lead up to 2030 to look at the extent to which SDG milestones have been exceeded, met, surpassed, unmet. And maybe then will serious questions be asked. I mean, UN peacekeeping is an anomaly these days, where peacekeeping missions are on the ground. There are threats like counterinsurgency, civil war, counterterrorism, and that goes against all principles of UN peacekeeping. So the UN will only intervene where it's a very specific situation, where it's just the monitoring of demarcation lines. And I suspect in the future, institutions that have relied on the UN for its international legal legitimacy in dispatching these missions will give their missions their own legitimacy. We're already seeing that with different regional organizations, including the EU and others, give political legitimacy. And I suspect they won't turn to the UN in the future to get that international legal legitimacy.
And we have come to the end of the session. Would you like to offer some parting words to our participants?
Just to thank everybody. It's been so lovely having this conversation this evening, and I hope I've hit on some points that interested the audience. So much you could talk about when it comes to diplomacy, but I think it's a totally underused tool. I do think a huge investment has to go into shaping the kind of people we want in the diplomatic circuit. We have to prioritize strategic communications, because Diplomats are those influencing from our country in the outside world, and they have to, in an age of information disinformation, set the record straight on how the nation works, how the people are, how the government operates, because others will try to take that space if it doesn't dominate.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fitz-Gerald, for spending time with us today. On behalf of the school, we wish you good health, and we really look forward to revisit the program that we started before the pandemic, and hopefully we can roll it out after the pandemic. We apologize, Anne, for any shortcoming and for accommodating our requests from the very beginning. To the participant, thank you for participating. Thank you for your views, for your feedback. We apologize some of the questions we are able to read it in view of the time. Till we meet again, please stay safe, everyone. Follow our program in our social media. Thank you very much once again. Assalamualaikum.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.